So yeah, we're going to, of course, go ahead and move on, of course, to talk about ancient Egypt today. Of course, I'll go into some of the background about Egypt, more or less. And of course, we've talked about the previous, 4 river valley civilizations, which, if you remember correctly, we've pretty much covered Mesopotamia, kind of gave you China already. We haven't done India yet, which we'll do that later. And then, of course, we've got ancient Egypt, which is the 4th, they say the 4th oldest, maybe, of the different river valley civilizations, which, of course, is based, I've talked about before, along the Nile River Valley, which is in kind of like northeastern Africa, North Africa, roughly. And the ancient Egyptians, they go back a long way. You could go back to the Stone Age originally. So they kind of start in really Neolithic times. Some people say even 4,000 or 5,000 BC. They could have had farming kind of starting at one point. But I'll get more into Egypt later. Egypt's history peaks more or less in the Bronze Age, like about 3,000 to about 1,200 BC. That's when they built like the pyramids and all that, as you know. So that's when their greatest civilization that they were. And then I think when the Iron Age came in later, they were not as powerful. Other powers came in and conquered them. And then later, Egypt was, like they said in the video, we're kind of part of other empires. So I'm going to be, of course, talking about predominantly like the geography of Egypt first. I'll get into that and discuss, the vast geography that they have. And one of the things I'll kind of show you is a map of Egypt itself, which is right here. Egypt itself is mostly desert today. I think it's like 90% desert overall. You can see all those green areas where the Nile River basin is, like the Nile River and the delta of the Nile, but you can see everything else around it is pretty much, desert, west to the east of the Nile. I think the only area you see that's kind of not part of that is an area that's called, it's called Fayum, which is like right here. Fayum is, they say, where Egypt started, like going back to Neolithic times, and then from there, the Egyptians spread to the rest of that region. And there's a famous saying you may have heard about by Herodotus. Herodotus was the one that made the famous quote, which is, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. So I think I added a slide on that, which is right here. But he said that famous quote, years ago in his, his histories of Herodotus. I think it's book 2. If you know about Herodotus, Herodotus was one of the first to really write about ancient Egypt. He even wrote about the pyramids, talking about how they think they were built and all that. And I think there's even stories that they claim that Herodotus even traveled to that region, explored that area, and learned about ancient Egypt. And I think he said at the time they had people that would actually have tour guides that would take you through the pyramids and all that, like they do today, I guess for a fee or whatever. So that's kind of interesting about that. But let me get more into ancient Egypt, like the background, like some of the stuff about the geography of Egypt. Well, if you go to this picture here, like I'm kind of showing you like another map. I think I've got right here. I think that one kind of shows you like more or less the map of the river and the Nile, which you can see the Nile is a very long river. One thing that the Nile River is very famous for, it's famous for its length, of course, which if you know about the Nile is about, they think with all its tributaries, almost 4,200 miles in length. It's pretty long. I think 4,189, I think is what I've got. The statistic on the actual length of the river and all its different tributaries combined. But most of the river is not in Egypt. Most of it's in the rest of Africa. In fact, parts of the river start way down in East Central Africa. It's also famous for the unusual course of the Nile. It flows from south to north, kind of flowing from the equator northward. Africa kind of, as we know about it, is like a bunch of escarpments that kind of flow down toward the Mediterranean Sea. The river itself has 2 main tributaries that really make up what becomes the main trunk of the Nile River. The two you can see there, you've got the White Nile and you got the Blue Nile. The White Nile starts way down in East Central Africa. I think they believe that the White Nile source, by the way, is hey, Tamia came in, but the White Nile source is believed to be Lake Victoria, and then Blue Nile source is mostly flows from like Ethiopia, like the eastern part of Africa, mostly I think from predominantly monsoons that feed it, like these rainy seasons on the coast of Africa. And majority of the water that goes down the Nile River goes down the Blue Nile. I think 70–80% of the water that flows like northward goes down the Blue Nile. If you notice there, I don't know if you can see very well with that map on the center there, but you'll notice these kind of numbers that are on the screen, 1 through 6. You can kind of see there. And anyway, they have what they call cataracts. The cataracts are a sets of rapids and waterfalls that are up and down the river basin from like upper Sudan, like northern Sudan. They flow into Egypt. In fact, the word cataract comes from the Greek word cataracta, which means waterfall. And so basically as the Nile is flowing from Sudan into Egypt, it's actually flowing downhill. Sudan is higher up. And so part of why they're numbered, like the cataracts are numbered 1 through 6 from like where Aswan is, which is like right here in the map. Like cataract 1, cataract 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They're numbered that way because the British, when they were exploring Africa in the 1800s, had to climb up the waterfalls to get to Khartoum, one of the major cities in Sudan today. So that's why they're numbered that way, basically. Then you can see the river then flows northward. You can see through Egypt and empties out into a large-sized delta where the Mediterranean Sea is. So most rivers have a delta to it. You can see this map here is kind of showing a larger-sized delta right here. In fact, the word delta comes from the Greek letter of the alphabet, the 4th letter, which is the delta, if you know about that, which is shaped like a triangle, hence the name where it came from originally. Now, one thing about that map, looking at it, kind of talk about, and by the way, I did want to mention too about the delta a little bit about it. I think this map doesn't show it very well, but if you go to this one, kind of at the top left, at one point they had 2 major branches of the Nile Delta they always talk about, which is the Damietta and the Rosetta. And I think the one on the left, which is like right here, that's the Rosetta. And I think this is the Damietta. So you got 2 main branches of the delta that flow out. And that's where they get the term Rosetta Stone. If you hear about the Rosetta Stone, they find later in Egypt. It's named after a town that's in the delta part of the right there in Egypt. So anyway, just kind of mention about that. Now going back to this map here, Egypt, you can see there, most of it, like I said, it's desert. But the areas that are fertile, like where everybody lives mostly in Egypt today, even back then and today, the ancient Egyptian name for Egypt is Kemet, which means different translations. Some people think it means black land. Some people think it means the cultivated land. These are the areas where, the fertile silt, I guess, that's washed up when they have the flood season. They use this to grow the crops of Egypt. And so that was often the ancient Egyptian nickname for Egypt, Kemet. I think Remet in Kemet meant people of Egypt too, in hieroglyphs. And then the desert areas, which you see are all around it, are often called Deshret, and sometimes a name they'll use for it, which means red land. It's also the nickname I think they call the Delta area too, as well, of Egypt. It's called Deshret, the northern part of Egypt. And They used to call it red land, which I believe the term came from the fact that when the sun would come up or go down on the east or west bank, it would kind of glow off of the desert and kind of give a pinkish reddish glow. Hence the term red land being used. Also, the crown of Egypt, in the northern part of Egypt, the pharaohs wore a red crown, which is the other, probably why they call it too as well. Looks like Brandon's joined us. Hey, what's going on, Brandon? You're doing great out there overall. So anyway, I also wanted to talk about as well, like how Egypt is also divided geographically. I think even today they still use it today. If you go back to this map I was showing you a little while ago, the northern part of Egypt and the southern part of Egypt have different nicknames that they often call it. Like the lower part of Egypt, which is sometimes kind of confusing, is actually the upper part of Egypt, which would be like the part here, like the northern part. So this is the northern part of Egypt. Right here, it's called Lower Egypt. And then as you go down here, the bottom of Egypt, you've got what they call Upper Egypt. So it's kind of confusing, I know, the difference, but it has to do with the river, like where it is in Egypt. There's another map showing it right here, I guess, roughly. So that's Lower Egypt, like here where Cairo is. Then where Luxor is what they call Upper Egypt. So it's the upper part of the river basin, hence the term being used. Then the lower part of the Nile River basin is where they get the different terms from. So Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. So it's kind of, I think the part in the middle where it says Nile right here, they sometimes use the term Middle Egypt to describe like in the middle part, but it's not used very much anymore. People used to use that term though sometimes to describe that area roughly. Now, also, Egypt has different growing seasons. I do have a slide I can kind of show you right here. But usually with farming, which was pretty important in ancient Egypt a long time ago, like these early river valley civilizations, they had different seasons. They usually had like at least 3 main seasons that they had during ancient Egypt, which they're often, I guess I'll put them up on the screen, but I don't think they're at the correct order, but Peret, Ket, and Shamu. Those are usually the 3 growing seasons they have, I guess, during this throughout the year. They don't have much of a winter, you know, in that part of the Middle East. Kind of like here, you don't have much of a winter either. We're close to the same area where they are, parallel, I guess, on them on the world map, I guess. But the first important season they have, you see there, is the one called Aket, which Aket, by the way, means on hieroglyphs, it means inundation. They say flood, but it means the flood season usually. But the inundation usually occurs starting around May, June, and it goes up to like maybe around September. And that's when the Nile River would flood. It would slowly inundate, I guess, and crest. The flood season was actually caused by the monsoon season, which affected East Africa. You know about that. They didn't believe that. They thought the gods caused the flooding, actually, believe it or not. Then they have another season called Peret. And then I guess after that would flood, and you'd have like the silt and all that. They would use that to grow the crops afterwards. Peret, the sowing season or the growth season. That occurred after the flood season, and they kind of went up to like part of the spring, I guess. And then you had the, I guess in the spring season, looks like from about February to like maybe May, June, you had what they call the Shamu, which is the harvest season, the season of the harvest, I think they called it sometimes. So that's all the different seasons they had, you know, during the year. These are the kind of crops they grew: barley, wheat, millet, sorghum, flax, which they used flax to make linen out of. That's what they, in ancient times, people wore linen cloth first. Well, they used other things like cotton and so on, at least in the West, the most. Date palm, of course, was used as well. You know, like the palm trees. They had grapes were grown. Different kinds of vegetables were grown as well. Fish, they ate fish like catfish and things like that. They had it back then. Different kinds of birds, I guess they could eat. Crocodile, They use the leather for the crocodile, the meat from it as well. Papyrus, which a little short video talked about, of course, it was a type of hedge plant, of course, that grew in the Nile River. They would make that, of course, to make paper out of it. In fact, the word paper originated from the word papyrus. And so, yeah, they were the first to kind of start, I guess, making the first paper. I think the first paper was that and parchment paper, which is animal skin as well. So, yeah, the ancient Egyptians were pretty advanced civilization. You have, like a writing system and things like that. Of course, they have, engineering, as we'll see later, like the pyramids. You see, of course, being built later behind me and all that. Hey, Nat, what's going on? Hope you're having a great morning out there overall. Hey, and Brandon, I think I said anything by, hey, what's going on also, by the way. So anyway, let me also talk about and move on. We're going to also get into and talk about how Egypt unified as a state, because they don't think Egypt was originally like one country. They believe. In fact, it's going to develop over time, like throughout, I think, the end of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age. You start seeing the unification of Egypt come about over time. I'll get more in today and talk about this king named Menes. We'll kind of spend a little time kind of discussing who he was and all that. But let me first talk about the fact that ancient Egypt, they think, formed out of two kingdoms originally, which the names that they called them was originally the upper kingdoms and, of course, called the lower kingdom. They have actually hieroglyphic names also as well, which I probably won't talk about. But they basically had these two states that were kind of side by side originally. And I'll kind of blow this up for later, I guess, if you want. And anyway, what happened over time was that they eventually combined into one state. In fact, what they think actually happened originally was that Egypt had these two kingdoms formed out of these agricultural districts that were called a nome. I think they said there were about 42 of them that were all throughout Egypt. It's not like, I don't think it was like a city state, maybe comparable to that, like say Mesopotamia, maybe similar. They think that these particular states were basically states that were run by a nomarch, who was like a governor, which I guess is kind of like a vizier later or something like that, is originally what it was. And anyway, over time, there was this king that emerged, named, you can see there, named Menes. Yeah, King Menes, which Menes, by the way, had different names that he went by. I know it's kind of confusing, all these different names. There's actually three names that he went by. The Greeks called him Menes or Men, M-I-N or M-E-N, something like that was the spelling of it. The sources, the Greek sources on him, of course, they call him Narmer, which I'll get to in a second about that. But the original sources on Menes are two. There's two sources on him. Herodotus was the original source, they think, that mentioned him. He called him Men, which is M-I-N or M-E-N. And Manetho, who's this Egyptian historian and priest that lived during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, he basically is another source as well. He wrote a book called History of Egypt, and he calls him Menes. So there's kind of a debate about, what the correct Greek name was, what they called him. But they had another name they called him, I told you, which of course was the hieroglyphic name, which is Narmer, they called him. I think Narmer is kind of a strange name, but they think it meant something like, something to do with a catfish, because they had a catfish in this cartouche, they say. I think it meant fierce catfish, I think is the actual translation. They think what it really means. I sometimes call them king catfish as well, or pharaoh catfish, if you want to call them that. But anyway, but Menes is important. Menes is believed to be the one that unified the state. He basically made, Egypt one kingdom or one empire at that time. And he also went on to found like one of their first dynasties. Like they talk about the pre-dynastic period of ancient Egypt that they have. And so he was able to combine Egypt into like one state. And they believe he may have been like a king of probably Upper Egypt at one point and combined both states together overall. He's also known for founding one of their first administrative cities and capitals, which of course is the city of Memphis, which the ruins of it is located, by the way, near Cairo today. Hey, Richard, good morning. I think Richard's in StreamYard right now. So, hey, hope you're having a great morning out there overall. So yeah, we're talking about like King Narmer, you know, how he kind of unified the state together right here. So Menez, Narmer, Men, it's all kind of the same person that we're kind of talking about overall. So anyway, I have some other slides I've got right here I can kind of share with you as well. Yeah, here's kind of showing you the different crowns that they had in ancient Egypt. The Menez, like I said, was one of the first major pharaohs that you have of ancient Egypt. In fact, the word pharaoh, if you remember correctly, in that little short video, meant great house. It's because, by the way, I don't know if they explained it, but it was named after the palace of where the pharaoh lived. I think it was at Memphis. And anyway, they believe originally that the kings of Egypt, which there were two at one point, one in Upper Egypt, one in Lower Egypt, they had two different crowns. The king of Upper Egypt had a white crown, and the king of Lower Egypt had a red crown. They had names for them, by the way. The one for the red crown was called the Deshret, and then the one for the white crown was called a Hedjet. So they combined them together over time, and Menez would wear both crowns together. And so the white crown goes on top, they think, and the red crown goes on the bottom. They had mascots, if you wonder about this. The one that's on the right had a cobra, its main symbol. The one on the left, which is the white crown, had a vulture. So it's kind of course, later on, you'll see all these different pharaohs, like sometimes on their crown or whatever, they'll have both the vulture and the cobra there. So both symbolize, the pharaoh and his two crowns that became one over time. So yeah, kind of talking about King Menez, how he, created the unified Egyptian state close to the beginning of the Bronze Age and all that. I did want to get into and talk about the different periods of Egypt as well. That's something that kind of, there's one more thing I did want to talk about Narmer, Menez, before I go. There's this thing called the Narmer palette you may have heard about. And it was a type of stone palette that they found in 1898 in Egypt. Archaeologists discovered it. It's a type of cosmetic palette that they think was used to grind cosmetics together, like to paint statues, which I think in ancient Egypt they would paint statues, like some of the gods and maybe some of the pharaohs or something like that. They would paint the statues. And supposedly this cosmetic palette depicts Narmer's reign. Like it proves that he was a real pharaoh, real person, and all that. And it actually depicts him unifying the state together. So I think on the one on the left, it first shows him as like the ruler of, I guess, Upper Egypt right here. And later on, they show him again over here. He's wearing the other crown as well. So anyway, this kind of depicts him, I guess, conquering it and unifying it together and all that. And so that's they do think he was a real, person as far as we know. All right, so he's really one of the most famous pharaohs you have of Egypt early on. I don't have too many famous ones, I think, until maybe the third, fourth dynasties kind of come in later, but he is part of the first dynasty that they have. Now, if you go to this slide right here, of course, you can see Egypt is broken up into different historical periods. Yeah, it's on both sides. I think Daph has asked me a question, which you can't see. She's in StreamYard, but it's on both sides. It's actually on each side. just kind of showing you both sides of it right there. But yeah, it's carved on both sides. Correct about that, if you're wondering about it. But anyway, but yeah, there's like three major periods of ancient Egypt. They usually break it down into, which is pretty easy to remember: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then New Kingdom. Done archaeologically from oldest to new. Those are about the dates of it. So obviously the Old Kingdom starts close to around the 26th century BC. You can see right there it ends about 22nd century BC. As you know, later the Old Kingdom is often nicknamed the Age of Pyramids. That's what they call it, or Pyramid Era Age, whatever you want to call it. Middle Kingdom's in the middle. You can see starts about 21st century BC. It's not as famous as the Old and New Kingdom. I don't usually talk much about the Middle Kingdom. It's a period of Egypt's kind of declining. It's also a period where the pyramid building kind of stops. In fact, I think around the 12th, 13th dynasty, they stopped building pyramids eventually. Then the New Kingdom starts about 16th century BC and goes down to about the 11th century BC, late Bronze Age. That's a period of empire building where Egypt flourishes as a great empire that pushes into like southwestern Asia. As far north as Syria at one point, ancient Egypt pushes into it. It kind of doubles in size, ancient Egypt. And it's also where you have a lot of great pharaohs that live. They were talking about King Tut and, all those, Queen Nefertiti lived, Hatshepsut, you may have heard of her, famous female pharaoh of ancient Egypt. Ramses the Great all lived during that time. So really it's more known for its famous people, like pharaohs, like kings that lived, of course, at that time, pretty much. You can see there's also these minor periods that they have as well. I've got a better picture showing you the different periods, I think, which is, let me put it right here on the screen. But this is how they usually break it out, the total time period of ancient Egypt. And so it's actually multiple periods overall. So the beginning part, you got the early dynastic period. That's the time of Menes, where Menes came in before the Old Kingdom came in right there. So you got the Old Kingdom right here, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. Now, they got these periods between them. They're called intermediate periods. First intermediate period, second intermediate period, third intermediate period. These are periods where Egypt basically broke up, like the kingdoms. It was like a chaotic period in ancient Egypt. So it's not a unified state at that time. There's even a period like the second intermediate period I'll talk about later, where Egypt is actually invaded by foreigners for the first time. So-called Hyksos invasion I'll get to later talk about. They had the late period, which the late period is a period where Egypt is invaded by foreign powers. So you get states like Syrians, Persians, the Greeks come in. They start invading Egypt. Ptolemaic Egypt is the period after Alexander the Great died, where the Macedonian Greeks created a dynasty of kings, pharaohs, that reigned over Egypt until the Roman period came in, where the Romans controlled Egypt for a few hundred years after that. So Egypt, as a state, has been controlled by a lot of foreign powers. I think it wasn't up to like modern times, like I want to say after World War II, that Egypt became more of an independent state. You got the Ottoman Empire, and others that kind of controlled it, for very long time. British, of course, were kind of in control there as well for a long time also. But yeah, Egypt really declines. Like it starts declining, especially out in the 11th century and afterwards. They usually call it the post-empire period is another nickname they sometimes call that period after the New Kingdom came out. So, all right, I'm going to get into next, and I'm going to talk about also, I want to get into like some of the gods of Egypt and discuss that today, like mythology. So we'll talk about that today. And then I'll also, one of the last things I'll get into is also get into talking about mummification, because Egyptians were very big in preserving, their bodies for the afterlife and so on. So Yeah, the Egyptians had a lot of different gods. I forget the number of gods that Egypt had at one point, but it's over 100 or more. So they're obviously a polytheistic type culture in general. Sometimes you'll see the term cult of Amun-Ra being used, I think, to describe some of the religions of ancient Egypt that they had. And they use that term because of the fact that the god Amun was considered one of their chief deities that they worshiped the most, which was later merged with the god Ra, who was the sun god in Egypt, which was worshipped in the temple of Karnak at Thebes. And a lot of other gods are anthropomorphic. That's something we'll kind of see as well. You know, they've got this deal where they're part animal, part man. Like those right there, I think Anubis, Horus, Sobek, Set, and Thoth are kind of known for being part animal, part god. Yeah, here's some examples of some of the gods that, of course, are well known. Of course, the god Amun, like I said, is the chief god that's worshipped the most. This particular god is the one that's worshipped, especially by the time of the New Kingdom. It's one of their chief gods that they worship. And later it was actually merged with the god Ra, sun god. Amun is usually in the image of a man or sometimes even a ram. It's like their state god that they worship. And sometimes a lot of the other gods are kind of seen as like manifestations of the god Amun. Like all the other gods are kind of like the same god. It's almost like a monotheism religion. It's almost monotheistic in a sense, because all these gods are kind of like manifestations of the same god, they think. But its cult center was at Thebes, as you know, where the temple of Karnak is, the ruins of today, one of the largest temples ever built. I think the temple is like 250 acres or larger in size. And it's pronounced different ways. The name, it's pronounced either Amun, Amun. Some people say Amun, I think is a common name. They'll call the god Amun. And the Greeks kind of see Amun as the god Zeus, or I guess the Roman equivalent of Jupiter. So sometimes the Greeks would call Amun, they would call it Zeus Amun. So when Alexander the Great, one of the first Greeks to invaded Egypt, he kind of saw Amun as the same god as Zeus he was worshiping at the time. There's other gods too as well. Ra, like I said, was merged with Amun, like with other gods they had as well. But Anubis, of course, another god that's also famous as well. Anubis is one of those anthropomorphic gods, part jackal, part man. And Anubis is seen as this god of like the dead. He's considered like one of those gods that judges the dead in the afterlife. He's often associated with funerary practices. In fact, a lot of priests, people that would embalm people, would usually wear jackal masks. So oftentimes, Anubis was the judge of the dead. Like he would judge people in the afterlife, their soul, if they were worthy to move on. I'll get to it later. They have this thing called the weighing of the heart, and supposedly Anubis is the one that weighs the heart and judges if you were a good or bad person, I guess. Another god that's also anthropomorphic is the god Horus, you may have heard of. And Horus is a very important god in Egyptian mythology. He's seen as the god that represents the pharaoh when he's on the throne. He's the god of kingship. He's the god of war. He's a sky god. He's part falcon, part man. And they believe that Horus in Egyptian mythology may have been the son of the gods Osiris and Isis. If you go to this picture image here, you've got Isis, who's considered one of the most famous goddesses in ancient Egypt. She's mostly a fertility goddess right there. In some mythologies, Isis is basically the mother of basically Horus. Yeah, she's a goddess of fertility, sex, marriage, alcohol, things like that. Oftentimes, she's very similar to the other god, which is Hathor. Hathor is another famous Egyptian goddess, which is kind of equivalent to Isis. That's, by the way, on the right, an image of, that's Isis right here, giving eternal life to Queen Nefertari, who's, by the way, one of the wives later of Ramses the Great. Also, the father of Horus is believed to be Osiris, who's like the god of the dead, sometimes king of the dead or king of the Egyptian underworld. He, of course, is famously, his wife is Isis, as you know. And in a lot of images, he's usually seen as a mummified man with the crown of Egypt on his head. And Osiris, by the way, is considered one of the oldest gods that goes back to ancient Egypt. He's kind of a popular god, especially during the Old Kingdom. And there's stories about Osiris that are very, very famous, with the most famous one being they call it the story of Osiris, considered one of the oldest mythologies in ancient Egypt. And according to ancient Egypt, Osiris was believed to be some type of king, the king of Egypt at one point. Anyway, he had this brother named Seth, and his brother wanted the throne. So his brother basically murdered him. You know the story about this? They played this game where he brought out this chest, and the idea of the game was for everybody to see who could fit in the chest. Well, nobody could fit in the chest. Everybody tried it. Set even tried it. Nobody could fit in it. Finally, Osiris got in the chest, and as you know, what Set did was he closed the lid on it, and then threw Osiris' body in the Nile, where he drowned. Well, supposedly Isis recovered the body. Somehow, I think there's a story where supposedly the body flowed all the way to where Lebanon is. Isis was able to recover the body, bring it back, and she was going to mummify Osiris to prepare him for the afterlife. However, Set got wind of that, and so he took basically Osiris's body and cut him into I think it was 14 pieces, I think is what it was. And he took each body part and he buried it all over Egypt. Well, Isis, the faithful wife, as you know, went back and she recovered the body parts. And she basically put Osiris back together and basically mummified him. And so that's why in a lot of images, there's Osiris right there. Osiris basically is a mummified, person because of that. So the ancient Egyptians believed heavily in mummification. It was important that your body be intact in the afterlife. Otherwise, basically, your soul would be destroyed. It wouldn't make it all through the afterlife. So yeah, that's the story of Osiris. Of course, Horus, if you study about Horus, what happened later, because the fact that Osiris is now the king of the dead. He's been kind of resurrected as this king of the dead and all that. Horus then battles Set for control of Egypt, and Horus defeats Seth and banishes him to the deserts of ancient Egypt. So that's why Horus is represented with the god of kingship and all that. Why pharaohs are usually seen as the pharaoh on the throne when they're alive. Now, when pharaohs die, they would then become one with, I guess, Amun-Ra is what would happen, and their soul would go to the afterlife, etc. There's other gods too that are also famous as well. Of course, I mentioned Set, which they think Set was some kind of cat god of some type, who was representative of different things, like the god of chaos. So he calls chaos in Egypt over the throne. Deserts, because he was banished to the deserts. Infertility, which kind of a side story I didn't really talk about, but supposedly Set took the penis of Osiris, and he threw it in the Nile, where it was eaten by a catfish. So what Isis did, she put a feather instead, for that to replace it. And somehow there was some kind of immaculate conception where Horus was born. They still had kids afterwards for some reason. That's kind of weird. It's kind of like the Virgin Mary story or something. What's interesting about that. Also, he's the god of storms. He caused like desert storms and things like that in Egypt. Set was very popular later with the Hyksos when they came into Egypt and invaded. They're kind of a desert people, and it was kind of a popular god with them. A few other gods they have too I'll mention. Of course, Thoth or Thoth, they pronounce either way, I think. That's a famous god. God of like wisdom and knowledge. He's kind of seen as this god of like Egyptian writing, hieroglyphics, the god of the scribes, the god of like science and medicine. So it's a very, very important god in ancient Egypt. It's usually a bird god, half bird, half man. And usually you'll see him in images. He's got a writing instrument in his hand, like some kind of stylus, I guess. And then he's got like a papyrus scroll in the other hand. I think the Egyptians believed that Thoth gave them papyrus to make paper out of and things like that. They used paper for other things. I think even part of their boats were made of paper papyrus as well. There's another you may have heard of called Sobek that was kind of popular as well, which is the crocodile god. You can see there. He's pretty big, and he's a god that was often associated with the Nile crocodiles, which I told you were used for different things. Used for food. They used it, of course, the leather for it for different things, for I guess their clothes and purses and things like that. It represented the pharaoh. It also represented male fertility. That's important. Also represented military power, like the armies and things like that. You can see it even had a cult center, which was located at Fayum. Fayum is this oasis area I told you of Egypt that's west of the Nile in Middle Egypt. All right, now one more thing I'm going to talk about today as well is mummification. We're going to talk about the so-called embalming process, of course, of ancient Egypt, which is pretty big. The fact that the Egyptians were known for mummification. Like Egyptians were heavy into the afterlife. They believed that the soul's journey through the underworld was important. Their body needed to be intact, and so that's why mummification was kind of important in the ancient world. They even practiced it up to into late period, I think, in ancient Egypt. They were kind of mummifying people. Like up to the Greek-Roman period, I think they kept doing it, believe it or not, in ancient Egypt. The term mummification, by the way, comes from a term which you can see there. Mummification comes from the word mummia, or mummia is how they say it, which it's an Arabic nickname they started using later when the Arabs kind of took over ancient Egypt a long time ago, and they use it for other cultures like the Incas. They use that term for that too, because the Incas kind of did the same thing. They preserved bodies in kind of a similar format as well. Also, you'll sometimes see it where it's like they'll find some dead body in a house, right? And they'll go, "Oh, it's been mummified." So they'll kind of use that term also as well. Yeah, Serena, it's a very curious topic, which it is. Which Serena's kind of get a comment. Yeah, it's very curious, of course, how they did it and all that. And the term mummy, by the way, comes from there's a substance that's called like a tar substance they use, which is right here, which is basically like asphalt. It was believed to have been used in the actual mummification process. The term bitumen, I think, is more the scientific name they use for asphalt. And but the Arabic name is mummia, which is spelled in all kinds of different ways. They'll spell it M-U-M-M-I-A. And sometimes you'll see it spelled the other way, but they'll spell it with a Y. That Y term, which throw on the screen if you want right here. But it's usually spelled either way. It's transliteration of the Arabic. So I guess the English version of it that you're looking at. So it's used in the embalming process. And they also believe that Mumia was used, believe it or not, in modern times, like early modern times. They would use it, they would grind it to make medicine out of it. They also made paint out of it too, believe it or not. I guess blackish type paints or something like that, dark color type paints. In fact, they usually, the medicine was called mumia or mummy powder. And people would take it and they'd put it like in their tea or whatever. It was supposed to give them vitality, make them live longer, stuff like that. And people used to do that kind of stuff, like arsenic, about that a long time ago, was used as a medicine originally. They found out later it was a poison, believe it or not. So anyway, so yeah. Well, there's of course other people that practice it too, Jessica. Like the Incas I talked about. Did kind of a similar thing where they preserve bodies, kind of similar format as well. I think there's some people like in South America before them that may have invented it. Can't remember the name of them, but that's one group as an example that's kind of famous for doing it. I'm not sure about other people. There's other people that also did it too, but I'm not sure right now who they are. But yeah, people that practice similar kind of type methods. But I'll get to it later. The desert acted as also a way for, preserving the body also. Now, I'm going to get into it. I'm going to talk about, like I said, the processes of how they did it. Because, mummification was a type of process that took a while in ancient Egypt. It took up to like 70 days actually to the embalming process. So it's not something that was, that was real quick. Also, it could be expensive. So obviously, most of the people that did it were probably more the wealthier type people. I think most people would just be put in the desert ground to preserve the body and all that. And they do think there were embalming like shops that would do this, where people would preserve the body, and they would have these chief embalmers that were involved in it. And they do think at one point there were probably books on it that existed at one point. But the process of mummification is mostly owed to like some of the old ancient historians, like Herodotus, I think, was one of the first to mention about the process and all that. So that's kind of why we know some information about it more than anything. A lot of them would wear jackal masks because they represented Anubis, the god of mummification, the god of the dead, who would like judge the dead, in the afterlife and all that. And so the process was quite, lengthy. I think there may have been at one point, I'll kind of go through a few, but they think there may have been as many as 10 processes that they went through to actually preserve the body. That's amazing. 10 of them. Well, there are different beliefs. Yeah, I'm sure there were, like with different cultures. Yes, correct. Which the ancient Egyptians believed that some people need the Book of the Dead, about that, to get to the next world. And so that's why they would kind of write that on the walls of their tomb and things like that, which were kind of like spells and incantations that would help them reach there, to reach the afterlife. And so, yeah, like the Egyptians believed that their body needed to be intact. If they were going to make it, if it was like in different pieces, they wouldn't make it. So that's something important. Why the mummification and why they built all these tombs. They were, I guess, to preserve the pharaoh's body and all that. But yeah, the first thing they would do, as you know, they would remove the organs from the body. The only thing they would keep in the body was the heart, which the heart was kind of important in their theology. They believed that Anubis would weigh their heart to see how good or bad they were, which would usually be weighed against a feather, if you know about that. And then the rest of the organs were put into like what they call canopic jars to preserve them. And they wouldn't keep the brain. I think some beliefs that, well, I don't know about today. Serena's asking a question about the process. Like how back then, yeah, it took about 7 weeks. Now they embalm you pretty quick. They got formaldehyde and things like that, and so they can probably embalm you in a day or two and have you pretty much preserved now. But obviously their process was a lot lengthy. Also the desert, like I said, the hot deserts also help to preserve your body as well, along with this embalming process that they had as well. But the various organs, by the way, were put in canopic jars, which I'll kind of show a picture of the canopic jars, which are right here. They were guarded by these sons of Horus, called the four sons of Horus, which you can see there. And those are the four sons. You had Domatef, Kabesonef, Hapi, and Imseti. Domatef protected mostly your stomach type organs. Kabesonef protected your intestines, mostly you can see. Hapi, the lungs, and then Imseti, the liver. And each one has an image of themselves, by the way, to kind of give you an idea. Domatef looks like a jackal, you can see. Kabesonef looks like a falcon. Hapi looks like a baboon. And then Imseti looks like a human. What happened was they then would take they usually salted, basically, preserved with salt, and then they would put them back in your coffin, is what they would do. Some movies, they show 5 canopic jars, but I think there were only 4 originally. Here's on the screen if you want them. I'll put them up again if you want it for later. But those are the 4 right there that they had. From there, they would then have to fill the body cavities. That's another thing that's kind of important with the process, which there's different theories on what went into the body cavities. Herodotus had all kinds of theories about that. He talks about this substance called pure myrrh, M-Y-R-R-H, some kind of tree resin that they put maybe from the palm tree that went into the body. Cinnamon bark, perfumes may have gone in the body. Some people claim they packed linen in there as well. He mentions about dry lichen, some kind of fungus plant that was put inside the body. So there's different theories about what went inside the body originally, a long time ago. And then one of the most famous processes that they do that's pretty important, they would then cover the whole body in what they call mineral salt, which in ancient times the Greeks called it natron, because it came from this salt lake that's west of the Nile Delta. Actually, the Nile Delta area called Wadi El Natron. And natron is a type of, it's like a type of natural substance that's kind of like similar to baking soda, that's found naturally throughout the world. In fact, here I put it on the screen for you. It's a mixture of sodium carbonate and also sodium bicarbonate. So it's very similar to baking soda. They would use this and they cover the whole body for about something like I think it's like 40 days. It's one of the longest processes in the mummification process. And that would help to get rid of all the moisture in the body, help preserve it later. Then the other thing they would do, one of the other big processes, of course, as you know, wrap the body, the mummy, in bandages, which that might take that took days too. They would wrap each part of the body a lot. That varied on that time. But you can see the total process could be, like I said, it could be like 7 weeks at the most overall. So from there, they had other processes. They would, I think usually most, like especially the more wealthier people, might have a death mask that they put on the mummy or paint it on the mummy, which I've seen as well that they have. They also would pour mumia on the actual mummy, like on the actual, after they do the bandages, they put the mumia, like the tar pitch, on the body. Now, there's some cases where I think they poured the tar pitch on the coffin after as well, to help preserve it. So all kinds of things like that, of course, that occurred. That's famous. So this process was, very popular. I think a lot of the upper classes and the middle classes, had their bodies mummified. But I think the poor people, they didn't have that. They got buried in the desert sand is what happened to them. But they found thousands of mummies, throughout ancient Egypt. They're still finding them, like all the time, like new ones, like new tombs that are being discovered, today, and all of that. And so mummification was, like I said, a very, very important process a long time ago. What's that? What was put inside the body and covered different social classes? There's kind of, they think, all similar, like the process that was done as far as they know. So the whole thing was pretty much the same for everybody, pretty much. But I'm not sure about what happens with the lower classes, and all that. They probably didn't have quite the same process like that they went through and all that because they couldn't afford it, things like that. So anyway, that's pretty much my lecture today, of course, on ancient Egypt. Now, I will have like part 2, part 3 later coming up, in the week. I think tomorrow I'll kind of have an announcement later about part 2, which part 2 is going to get more into talking about the age of pyramids. I'm going to kind of, discuss more into, talking about tomb building. That's one thing, the ancient Egyptians are kind of famous for, where they build these massive tombs throughout ancient Egypt for their pharaohs. So we'll get more into that and talk about that. So that's one of our main things I'll get into. I'll kind of talk about also the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. That's kind of important too in ancient Egypt. So if you have any comments, questions about this lecture, let me know. I know it's kind of hard to kind of do a lot of questions back and forth with this lecture, but you can send me comments, questions later through my YouTube channel, and I can probably give you a better answer on certain questions after I've kind of maybe done some more research on that. But anyway, that's it for today overall. Like I said, don't forget, I have certain assignments that are out there right now. Y'all need to be kind of working on. You got that China quiz, of course, the main one. That 2 lectures I had, of course, on ancient China. Great Wall documentary video quiz you got as well. And don't forget, your first vocab is due today. So that's something you need to start turning in today in Canvas. Is under the speed grader, of course. So basically start turning that in this week. Get that done. I'll probably give you a few days on it to kind of turn it in. I know it kind of sometimes take you a while to get it in. But yeah, do try to, of course, get that done. So I'll see y'all later. Yeah, Madison, have a great course rest of the week, everybody. And of course, I will see you tomorrow for part 2 on ancient Egypt. So y'all take care.